In April 2023, I began a search for surviving copies of Asia's first newspaper, Hicky's Bengal Gazette. In the digital archive of the University of Heidelberg, I found a few digitally scanned issues of this paper. One was dated Saturday, March the 3rd to Saturday, March the 10th, 1781. The masthead on the yellowed page read, Hicky's Bengal Gazette, or the original Calcutta General Advertifier. Below this, in smaller font, it said, a weekly political and commercial paper open to all parties but influenced by none. The font had faded after 2 centuries and proved a bit difficult to read. The page led with the news that the East India Company's Court of Directors had strongly recommended the conquest of Mauritius and Bourbon, now called Reunion Island, to the Secret Committee of Madras in a letter dated 23rd November 1759. The words on the page were extraordinarily confident. There were no telltale phrases of hesitation. James Augustus Hicky, the owner and editor of this newspaper, whose name also boldly lived on the masthead, would collate letters written to him bearing information and manually format each word, sentence, paragraph, and column for printing. When I was a student of journalism many moons ago, I had read about Hicky in a textbook on the history of the Indian press. The details about him were scant, and we weren't really going to be tested on Hicky in an exam, so the name became trivia, something I filed away in my mind. 2 decades later, when Sumit and I decided to put this podcast together, Hicky's name surfaced in my thoughts. I realized I still did not know anything about him. But now I had the internet. Who was James Augustus Hicky? Where did he come from? Why did he decide to start a newspaper in a place that really wasn't home to him? I wanted to understand him. The only things I knew about James Augustus Hicky was that he had started the first newspaper in India. He did not like the governor of Bengal, Warren Hastings, or Mrs. Hastings for that matter, and he was Irish. I spent the next few weeks looking at digitized archives in Ireland and Northern Ireland. There are very few that date back to the mid-1700s, which is presumably when Hicky was born, around 1740. We don't know which county he was born in though, so I began looking at church registers that recorded births, baptisms, deaths, marriages, and so on. The name Hicky came up many times across counties in Ireland, Patrick Hicky, John Hicky, but I couldn't find a James Augustus Hicky born in 1740. I gave up. Sumit and I decided to tell his story through the excellent work of his biographer, Dr. Andrew Otis, who is also a friend of this podcast. It would have been great if I could have found something, anything, that tied Hicky to where I now lived, on the island of Ireland. I thought maybe I could trace his descendants. Maybe I could drive up, knock on their doors and say, "Did you know your ancestor started the first newspaper in India? How cool would that have been?" But sometimes in this line of work, a story reaches a dead end. There are no more leads, or you're just exhausted, and there are other projects that demand your attention. And then, a few days before we recorded this episode, I found something. I had decided to look again just for the sake of being thorough and giving this one more shot. In a Church of Ireland record from 1738, one that I hadn't seen before, in difficult to decipher casual scroll, I found the listed baptism of one James Hicky. I had searched for so long that for a moment I entertained the possibility that this was the man I was looking for. I couldn't be sure though, and there is no way to verify it, so I did the next best thing. I sent a screenshot of the document to Dr. Andrew Otis, Hicky's biographer. He was quick to respond and told me that this was probably the wrong record, because the name listed as Hicky's father was different from what he had found during his research. We will put this document up on our socials so you can take a look for yourself. I guess lots of people were called James, and Hicky seemed to be a fairly common last name in Ireland back then. Also, centuries have passed. Ireland is a divided island, and with this geographical and political division, there has also been a division of history and of historical records and archives. In my mind, not being able to find a verifiable record of Hicky's birth or baptism is tragic. However, he left behind a remarkable legacy. This is the story of James Augustus Hicky. You are listening to Reality Scribes. I am Vasundhara and Sumit.
And I am Sumit Chaturvedi. We are Indian journalists who in this podcast are telling you the story of the origins of Indian journalism and taking you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries. In February 1773, an Irish surgeon's mate disembarked from a ship called Marquis of Rockingham and made his way down the streets of the Indian city of Calcutta, now known as Kolkata. This was James Augustus Hicky. As he walked, he eyed the mansions of wealthy Europeans that lined the banks of the Hooghly River and made his way further inland. He crossed White Town, populated mostly by Europeans, and explored Black Town, the marginalized area where Indians lived alongside less wealthy Europeans. Many from economically weaker sections of European society did not possess the official licenses given by the East India Company to live and operate in India. So they drifted on the margins of European society in Bengal in racially ghettoized areas like Black Town. This is where Hicky chose to live. Calcutta was a city where opulence coexisted with poverty, fortune with misfortune, and prosperity with subaltern misery. Hicky was born in Ireland sometime around 1740. He joined the British Navy as a youngster and then decided to try his hand at surgery after reading a few books on the topic. After being in the merchant navy for a while, he got passage to India as a surgeon's mate. India was a destination for Europeans to find wealth and build their fortunes in the 1700s. Many from the poorer rungs of European and British society also made their way to India and often returned home with a king's ransom and eagerly awaited the upward mobility or titles that such ill-gotten wealth could guarantee. Hicky was no different. He had a fortune to make, and he was sure India was the place to find it. The first few years in India were quite tumultuous for him. At the very start of his Indian experience, Hicky worked as a surgeon. Later, he borrowed money to buy a seafaring vessel so he could trade between Calcutta and the Madras Presidency. Unfortunately, in 1775 or 1776, bad weather intervened and damaged his cargo. His debts were also due, and soon his bankers came calling. In October 1776, Hicky went to jail in Calcutta for being a debtor and was stripped of all his assets by the bankers he had borrowed money from. Hicky, however, had planned for this eventuality. He had given a trusted friend a sum of 2,000 rupees for safekeeping, and while in jail, he used that money to build his own printing press. He smuggled tools into jail, hired carpenters, and purchased types that he needed to print handbills, almanacs, insurance forms, and even documents for the Supreme Court. You must be wondering, how did a man self-trained as a surgeon who then jumped ships both literally and figuratively to become a naval merchant eventually find safe haven in printing as a business? Well, printing had gradually evolved since the mid 15th century as one of the more commercially viable trade prospects, especially in the European colonies across the globe. In fact, it was on the other end of the globe, in the continent of North America, that printing had become a profitable trade venture in the 18th century. As Lucien Febvre and Henry Jean Martin wrote in their seminal work Coming of the Book on the history of printing, much like Hicky, the printers in America were making their money printing acts, local laws, almanacs, among other routine material. But there was a catch. Febvre and Martin write that in practice, only those printers survived who were appointed as official printers by colonial administrations, and even their position was far from secure. They add that often colonial governors lacked trust in printers and hesitated to let them establish themselves. Hicky would soon discover this himself. But for now, Hicky was working hard, hopeful of reaping benefits from his carceral business, enough to let him out of jail by paying off his debts. Other inmates often saw him working from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. the next morning. Hicky's transgressions were not really that severe. It was a mystery why he remained in prison. But his lawyer William Hicky, who is unrelated to James Augustus Hicky, observed in his memoir that James was so notorious that other lawyers were scared to represent him because he was known for his passionately abusive outbursts.
William Hicky decided to represent James Hicky in court on one important condition. James Augustus Hicky had to promise that he would not bounce up in court every 5 minutes to complain of his lawyers to the judges. Hicky promised he wouldn't. In 1778, when his trial finally started, he did exactly that. Bounce up in court and yell whenever he was annoyed by something. William Hicky gave him a legendary dressing down for his behavior, calling him a lying vagabond scoundrel. James Hicky fell to his knees, weeping before the judges of the court in Calcutta, asking them to help patch things up between him and his lawyer. By late 1778, Hicky had won his cases against his creditors. He was free now to pursue his fortune once more. He decided to stick to printing. Soon, Hicky secured a huge contract for printing work from the East India Company's army to print regulations, which could significantly curb the corruption rampant within the army ranks. Earlier, regulations were handwritten, and they had been amended and reissued so many times that chaos ruled. Printing them would make the code of conduct and rules for officers clear and leave nothing ambiguous. The problem was that those employed with the East India Company's army thrived on legal ambiguity. For instance, some officers held 2 commissions and received double pay. Other officers would not properly certify their muster rolls, and that allowed them to collect the pay of troops that had died or had deserted or existed only on the rolls. Once the regulations were printed, this ambiguity would disappear, along with these perks that so many had been fully taking advantage of.
These officers posed many obstructions in Hicky's path. They would not send back his proof sheets in time. They twiddled their thumbs over all communications they got from Hicky. One officer with extra skin in the game was Colonel Thomas Dean Pierce, the commander of the East India Company's Artillery Corps. The new regulations that Hicky had been tasked with printing would effectively disband the Artillery Corps, leaving Colonel Pierce without an artillery to command and no weight to throw around. He was hell-bent on stopping Hicky from ever printing the regulations. So what did he do? Well, when Hicky got an assistant called Thomas Jones, who was a newbie in Calcutta but had prior artillery experience, Colonel Pierce recalled him to the army, leaving Hicky without an assistant. Hicky's work had come to a standstill. He had sunk a huge amount of money into completing an order of printing approximately 38,000 pages of rules and regulations, of which he had already completed 21,000. But the officers seemed intent on stopping him in his progress. Hicky was angry. He needed more money and assistance, and more importantly, he could see how unfairly the East India Company and its officials were behaving. He wanted to be much more than a mere printer, but there were too many people standing in his way. There was another way. In fact, American printers had paved it. They too had faced a lot of adversity at the hands of the colonial governors, as we have already mentioned. They had realized that official assignments just would not be enough. It was then that their gaze turned towards a print product that had already existed. Something that was not a one-time product. Something that needed to be consumed daily just like bread or vegetables. It was a print perishable. It was the newspaper. What Benedict Anderson, the author of the book Imagined Communities, has called an extreme form of the book. A book sold on a colossal scale, but of ephemeral popularity. One-day bestsellers. The Indian scenario was similar to the one in America in that in both places there was a burgeoning population of colonial settlers, something that Callie Wilkinson mentioned in our previous episode. In America, newspapers mainly became popular because this new population needed a source of information that could connect them to the world and, more importantly, their homeland thousands of miles away. That is where the printer journalist emerged. Someone whose main source of income would be the newspaper, and to which they were usually the main and sometimes the sole contributor. Hicky was clued in to the developments in America like a lot of people in Britain and Europe, especially because of the American Revolutionary War being at its peak at the time. Knowing the power and, more importantly, the viability of print journalism from the American experience, it wasn't a surprise that he too decided to become a printer journalist himself.
So, on the 29th of January 1780, the first edition of Hicky's Bengal Gazette was published in Calcutta. It laid the foundation for the modern press in India, and James Augustus Hicky secured his place in history and in that history textbook that I read as a first-year college student. But was he really a crusader for truth, a principled champion of the free press, a David-like figure standing against Goliath in the form of the East India Company? There is someone who knows Hicky more intimately than we ever could. This is Dr. Andrew Otis.
I was in college, and I think I was writing my senior thesis or something like that back in 2011, and I happened to come across the memoirs of Hicky's lawyer, also named Hicky, and I thought, oh, this is sort of a fascinating character in India's historical past, and I put that away for a while, and I ended up applying for this research grant. I went to the British Library, and I sort of retook up Hicky there, because I had a grant to look into press history in India and South Africa and British colonies around the world. And I kept coming back to Hicky because he seemed to be the most dynamic and fascinating character of many places. So I thought, maybe there's a story here. And I sort of realized that no one had written, sort of a fully fleshed out, investigated book. And I thought maybe this is something that I could pursue. I like to say that I fell into the topic more than I think a lot of scholars in the US and the UK, for instance. They have a background in Indian history. They know the topic inside and out. And I fell in it, like I said, from a more journalistic standpoint. I saw a good story, and I really thought this is something worth pursuing. And then I thought, maybe I could be the person to do it. So it all kind of rolled down the hill from there.
In 2013, Andrew was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to look into the emergence of the press in British colonies. During his research, he was captivated by Hicky's newspaper and decided to look further into its history. Of course, just like we did when we were scripting this episode, Andrew found himself developing an equation with the ghost and memory of a remarkable man. His deep research into Hicky's life led to the publication of his book, Hicky's Bengal Gazette, the untold story of India's first newspaper, in 2018. Andrew now works for the Chronicle of Higher Education and is based in Washington, D.C.
Andrew's fresh approach in writing this historical account makes the book different and a lot more interesting than regular historical books. This narrative non-fiction book took a long time to research. There were very few surviving court records about Hicky, and as an American researcher in India, Andrew had a challenging time navigating Sarkari or the government archives or offices in which Hicky's life existed on those old and fragile sheets of paper. Hicky had always wanted to stay away from any political influence, but his business instincts were spot on. In the absence of any other newspaper, Hicky's Bengal Gazette became an instant sensation. Plus, he did everything to make his paper saucy, raunchy, and sensational, including gossiping about people's sexual orientations and making fun of people through satire and mockery. Yet, he never shied away from reporting on important incidents or events which needed immediate attention from the authorities. His coverage on wars between the Indian rulers and the company gained him an international audience with many British papers such as the London Courant, London Chronicle, Public Advertiser, British Evening Post, and the Lady magazine reprinting his news. He also looked at the humanitarian tragedy of famine that had devastated the Bengal countryside in 1770. This natural instinct that he possessed for important concerns of the day always found a space in his humble paper. With time, his journalism only grew more serious. We picked Andrew's brain about the perspective and the trajectory of Hicky's journalism.
Hicky kind of sees himself as part of the subaltern club. And at the same time, is that something that sort of defines how he feels about, say, the famine in Bengal, which he does quite a great job of reporting on by saying that, there are so many people dying and this is what's happening in the streets. So I don't know, but I wonder if there's some sort of self-identification that he goes through.
Yeah, I don't know what level of class consciousness he had. And I think that's really in its beginning stages. I don't think they really had the vocabulary yet to really identify with a sense of class. But I think there is the idea there that we should, as an editor, as a printer, that what is newsworthy is not just what is at the top, right? So there's the necessity to cover a wider variety of topics than you might otherwise expect. So I think although he doesn't have perhaps a sense of, we might say the word subaltern, we might use lower class to upper class, right? Those terms don't really exist in the same sense they do now. But there is, without having those words and terms, I think there's perspective that more needs to be covered.
The way his career evolved as an entrepreneur in journalism to eventually a journalist, how did he evolve? Because initial writings of his are sort of sensationalist in some ways. There is a lot of hearsay, there is a little bit of gossip in the columns and all, and eventually then he evolves as a journalist. So how do you see his evolution as a journalist throughout his career?
That's a great question. There's this moment where Hickey's writing his newspaper, and it's fairly apolitical from the beginning. And there's basically this moment where he gets wind that there's another newspaper in the offing, and that's a newspaper supported by basically the East India Company government, the Warren Hastings, the Governor General, and Hickey's very upset by this because he knows that the other newspaper is going to have government support, which means it's going to be a competitive advantage to him. And I think from that moment, he really decides that, look, I can talk about merchant issues, I can talk about sensationalist issues all day long, right? But what's really the purpose of what I'm doing? And what Hickey does is he actually recalls conversations that he had with some of Warren Hastings' aides, a man named Simon Droz, for instance, and he accuses them of soliciting bribes from him. So Hickey says, look, these men who are also supporting this newspaper, they solicited a bribe from me about 10 months back when I founded my newspaper. I refused to pay them, and because I refused to pay them, they're going to get revenge on me, and they're going to ruin my newspaper. So from that moment on, he really starts to change the tack. He starts to call it corruption a lot more in the East India Company. And I think, you can talk about high ideals and high-mindedness all day long, right? But sometimes what causes a change is simply, wanting to get revenge or simply wanting to get even with someone. So this is a way for him to get even with some of the men that he thinks screwed him over. And there's so much of that in the story that I write, which is just someone wanting to get even with someone else, and that actually leads to some of these, really beautiful. I don't know if beautiful is the right word, but really these strong critiques of corruption. And I think that story is all about these personal motives mixed with, high ideals of what is representation, what is freedom of the press, who gets to say in the public sphere. And I think that's why the story is really interesting.
Hicky had indeed taken it personally. A rival newspaper had come up with the government's patronage in what he felt was a deliberate attempt by Simeon Rose, the chief of the Board of Trade in Calcutta, to sabotage his paper. This new newspaper was called the India Gazette and debuted its first edition in November 1780, 10 months after Hicky had started his newspaper. The founders of the paper were Bernard Messing and Peter Reed, two men who had absolutely no prior experience in printing. Messing was an actor of sorts, and Reed had once been an attorney for William Bowles and had witnessed his deportation. What Reed had learned from observing the treatment meted out to William Bowles was to indulge in anticipatory capitulation to the East India Company's government in Bengal if one had to run a newspaper. In short, for Messing and Reed, the India Gazette was a money-making tool. If that meant echoing the company government and amplifying its message, sure, why not? If this sounds familiar to any of the stuff you're observing today in India or the United States, you're not alone and you're not wrong. Hicky wanted to change society, reform it, but now it was clear to him that his work was going to be undercut by people he thought had no moral compass. This is what Hicky wrote in his paper in November 1780. I have no particular passion for publishing of newspapers. I have no propensity for them. I was not bred to a slavish life of hard work, yet I take pleasure in enslaving my body in order to purchase freedom for my mind and soul. He would use his intelligence and his life's experience of always being the outsider, the debtor, the chancer, the one that people looked down upon due to his Irish heritage. He would use all of this and put it in his newspaper. It would finally contain all of him. It would speak for him. It would say all the things that he wanted to say to those powerful men who thought that they were gods lording it over a country they did not belong to. So, Hicky published a long account of exactly how Simeon Rose had offered to take him to Mrs. Marian Hastings, the wife of Governor-General Warren Hastings, at their estate called Belvedere and seek her blessings to start his newspaper. At the last minute, Hicky had turned back. He thought it was odd and awkward, and he did not think he needed permission or patronage to start a newspaper. He did not want to capitulate to power even before he had started. In what comes next, we need some context to understand Governor-General Warren Hastings' actions. You see, Hastings was not new to India. He had joined the East India Company as a teenager, at the lowest rank of a writer, and had worked his way up. However, after witnessing the wars fought by the East India Company to control Bengal, Warren Hastings resigned from the company and went home to England, only to find that his son had died. He spiraled and began carelessly spending the fortune he had made in his years of service to the East India Company. By 1767, his badly managed fortune, including £25,000 that he had given to a friend to manage, was gone. He knew that the only way to make a fortune again was to return to India. On Robert Clive's recommendation, Hastings was sent back to India as the second in command of the Madras Council. By 1772, he had managed to reorganize the way the company functioned in the Madras Presidency. This had impressed the company's court of directors, and they were looking for someone who could initiate reforms in their most profitable territory, Bengal. Warren Hastings became their guy. Hastings knew that if he had to run Bengal like a tight ship, he needed to consolidate power. He began doing this by first outsmarting any detractors and competitors, like Philip Francis, who he famously shot and wounded in a duel, and awarding contracts and positions to many people to buy their loyalty. Simeon Rose was also a part of this group that Hastings favored.
When Hicky's allegations were published, Rose defended himself by basically calling Hicky a liar. Governor General Warren Hastings was enraged by Hicky's audacity to go after a prominent officer of the company like Rose. He declared that Hicky would not be able to mail his newspaper through the postal service anymore, nor could anyone else do it on his behalf. He even allowed the Postmaster General to inspect any mail suspected of carrying Hicky's newspaper. The notice authorizing this was signed by the Secretary of the East India Company government, a man called Edward Hay. This became the first serious act of censorship against a newspaper, killing the circulation to kill the paper. But Hicky was not a pushover. He had always avoided clashing directly with Governor General Hastings until now. When Hastings banned the Bengal Gazette from accessing the postal service for newspaper delivery, Hicky was enraged. Things escalated quickly. To counter this ban, Hicky hired 20 harkaras. Well, if you have listened to our first episode, you know how important harkaras were in carrying information for miles across the Mughal Empire. What we didn't tell you then, because we were saving it for now, is that as the Mughal Empire declined, harkaras became carriers of the post when the postal service was established, and often hired themselves out as security guards and goods and message carriers within cities as well. Hicky knew that harkaras were the best bet for delivering his newspaper. Thanks to these harkaras, the original newspaper delivery men in India, Hicky's Bengal Gazette was able to survive. In fact, its subscriptions increased, and Hicky's subscribers even signed a public letter in his support. He was called the Papa of the Bengal press. This encouraged him to take a principled stance against Hastings on press freedom. He had become an influencer. In the concluding passage of one of his letters printed in the Bengal Gazette, he wrote, "And let them see that he is a free man of the first city in the British Empire, and that he has a power to print a newspaper that no East India Company nor the king, their master, can wrest out of his hands. It is beyond the prerogative of the British Crown to invest the company or their servants with such a power." Talk about being dramatic. Our Indian news anchors can't hold a candle to this guy. Except that Hicky's passion was not in defending the government as most Indian news anchors do today. He was attacking corruption and malpractices within the East India Company's administration.
While Hicky did raise important concerns about urban infrastructure earlier, now his focus shifted to political corruption. Hicky encouraged people in the East India Company army and others to correspond with him and write letters to expose the corruption of Hastings's regime on three main issues: contracts, nepotism, and taxation. The grounds for criticism were impropriety, procedural irregularity, and lack of due representation, particularly for British citizens living in India. Hicky's newspaper had come a long way from being merely a source for the European community in Bengal to catch up with the news from the world and their countries back home. Its readers had now become its contributors. Public opinion was taking shape in the company's Bengal presidency, thanks to Hicky's Gazette. Callie Wilkinson, historian and friend of the podcast, had an interesting insight to share with us about the engagement of readers with newspapers with regard to reading and contributing to them in the 18th century.
For historians of print, one of the things that's really hard is reception. So it can be really hard to understand how are people reacting to what they're reading and how is it changing their opinions. And I think one of the advantages of working on the 18th and early 19th century is that because they didn't really have journalists in the way that we think of journalists, they often struggled to get content for their newspapers. And so editors were often very happy to just print a lot of reader submissions. And in part, that was kind of pragmatic because it just gave them something to publish. But I think also there was there's a principle to it as well. There's an idea that people have a right to participate and people have a right to say what they think. And you have to be cautious because, in the same way as today, I do feel like, not everyone is writing letters to the editor. And even at the time, they had stereotypes of like, who are the kind of people who are likely to write letters to the editor. It's those people who are maybe like loudest in conversation and who have the most confidence in their point of view. So, they're not always the most representative. But it's a more common practice than it is today. Today, how many people would ever write a letter to the editor? But the evidence suggests that in the past it was fairly common. And these letters do give us a lot of insight in bits and pieces about how they're reacting to it and also how they're being read. And so it's through these letters to the editor that you learn, okay, they'll talk about, for example, sometimes they'll write a letter to the editor of a newspaper that they don't actually subscribe to, but they'll say something like, this was being read aloud in the mess hall, or a friend showed me a copy of your journal. And so it gives you an idea of how far these newspapers are circulating.
Hicky also published brutal criticisms of Hastings' military strategies that were employed in various military expeditions being carried out by the company. In particular, he attacked the long march undertaken by his old enemy, Colonel Thomas Dean Pierce, who, with Hastings' blessing, was taking 5,000 soldiers from Bengal to Madras. The march was long and awful. Pierce's troops had little food and often ravaged villages for what meat and food they could find. Many soldiers got sick and died. The army marched slowly, and Hicky encouraged soldiers to write letters to him and report what was going on. And this is how the nickname Colonel Snail was born in the pages of Hicky's Gazette, to refer to Colonel Thomas Dean Pierce, who, if Hicky was to be believed, was not only militarily incompetent, but also an immoral pleasure seeker. On one occasion, Hicky even bordered on sedition when he suggested that the army should mutiny and even carry out a coup. Warren Hastings was not spared in the pages of the Bengal Gazette either. Clive's miserable successor, a wild, pusillanimous, disgraceful and wicked man, despotic and infatuated agent, the great Mughal. These were some of the names that Hastings was called in the pages of Hicky's Bengal Gazette. Then there was the insinuation that Hastings suffered from erectile dysfunction. We all chuckled when this came up, but Andrew had a deeper insight to share with us.
Hicky calls out, he says, Warren Hastings' perennial spring is broken, which is like a euphemism for erectile dysfunction. But really it means more than that. I mean, he's talking more than just Warren Hastings having erectile dysfunction. Hicky probably means it's more in a not a literal sense, but saying that, like, look, this guy doesn't have what it takes to be an effective leader, and so why should he be our leader at all if he can't do what's needed? And so, those types of arguments, when you mix the personal invective with the more high-minded ideals, no one likes having themselves called out, and especially at this time, honor is really important. So that really irks Hastings.
Of course, Hastings was not the only target of Hicky's journalism. Another person whom Hicky held responsible for trying to sabotage his paper and went on to expose for his alleged corruption was Johann Zacharias Kiernander, the first missionary sent to India by a religious organization called the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. Kiernander had established a church in India under its aegis. After many failed years as a missionary living on scraps in the Madras Presidency, Kiernander relocated to Calcutta to restart his mission. However, he had convinced himself that doing God's work meant amassing wealth so that he could serve the poor better. This avarice meant that Kiernander began resorting to fraud to gain control of more money. At the start, he even solicited Hicky to print his almanacs. Later, he found that Hicky was plagiarizing his almanac and selling it himself. Kiernander began distributing his material for free. This was the first time the two butted heads. There was something else going on in the background with Kiernander that no one knew about. He had an assistant, Johann Christian Diemer. Diemer was an upright guy who soon discovered the ways in which Kiernander hoarded wealth for his operations. This included using Diemer's allocated salary to support an additional missionary instead of paying him from the common mission fund. After a series of events where Kiernander and Diemer were at odds, Diemer sought revenge. He went to Hicky and told him how the publishers of Hicky's rival newspaper, the one that Warren Hastings had backed, had procured the types and the printing press from Kiernander through his old missionary friends. Diemer also told Hicky that Kiernander had embezzled money from a fund left as a legacy to his mission by a Captain Griffin, and had even committed tax fraud in the name of the mission. Hicky gathered evidence and published a litany of charges against Kiernander.
Kiernander, a man who had lived in India from his youth, was now old and had failing eyesight. His spirit, which had survived hardship, starvation, the deaths of his wives and children, was still strong. He decided to fight back. He sued Hicky on 2 counts for libel. That was not all. Warren Hastings also sued Hicky for libel on 3 counts. We can stop here and reflect on Hicky's legacy at this moment in time, when he was being sued by both church and state. He was all alone in an uncharted terrain in Asia at the time. Printed and publicly declared critique of power, whether it emanated from religion or the state, was very, very rare at the time. The clashes with people who ran the state and the church had triggered something in Hicky that made him place the truth above everything else in his life. This drive, this need to bring power to heel, to mock it, to criticize it, to permit the public to question it, to allow people to even think of dissenting against power, to build an audience that demanded accountability from those that thought they were running the show. These are the reasons that Hicky and his newspaper got into legal trouble. These are the reasons that those who ran the East India Company's government in Bengal in the late 1700s saw Hicky as a danger to them, their careers, their profits, and their ability to control a country they had no business controlling. The cases of libel against James Augustus Hicky were the first ever legal challenges to the freedom of the press in India. What became of Hicky and his Bengal Gazette? That's next time on Reality Scribes.
We would like to thank Dr. Andrew Otis for sharing his insights and experiences with us that helped shape this episode. You will hear from him in part 2 of this episode as well next time. We would also like to thank Dr. Callie Wilkinson for her invaluable inputs for our podcast that you will listen to in even greater detail in our future episodes. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated and produced by Vasundhara and me, Sumit Chaturvedi. All source material used in this episode can be found in the description below. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time.